Welcome to Mental Health in the Time of Coronavirus, your computer-side chat with the experts. Today we will discuss, is America in an abusive relationship with its president? I am Dr. Bandy Lee, president of the World Mental Health Coalition, a professional organization that focuses on having healthy leaders in order to promote societal mental health. We have two speakers this evening, both esteemed and courageous authors in The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. First is Harper West, a licensed psychotherapist in Clarkston, Michigan, who is the award-winning author of Pack Leader Psychology and an innovator of self-acceptance psychology as a way of developing adaptive responses to fear, trauma, shame, and lack of secure attachment. Next is Dr. Edwin Fisher, a clinical psychologist, a professor in the Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and editor of Principles and Concepts of Behavioral Medicine. In addition to community and peer support in health and healthcare, he has written on depression, schizophrenia, and the relationships between mental and physical disease. First, we will start with Harper West. Harper?
Well, thank you, Bandy. It's a pleasure to be here. This subject certainly is near and dear to my heart because this was the topic of my chapter in Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. I wrote about being in a relationship with an abusive president. So I first would like to just pause and do a bit of a safety check with anybody out there listening. Apparently there's been a large increase in domestic violence in this time of home quarantining, a lot of stories about people drinking excessively, which of course increases the risk for domestic violence. So I just wanted to say, please be safe. If you find yourself in a risky position, reach out to a resource in your community or a friend. And if you know of a friend who might be in a dangerous relationship, please check on them. It seems to be a big factor right now. So having said that, I'll dive into talking about whether Trump is abusive. Many people use terms of narcissistic or sociopathic to describe Trump, and those certainly could be included. But we'll stick with the term abusive for today, and recognize that most abuse is emotional and not physical, of course. So I'd like to start by defining what healthy relationships are, comparing them, of course, to an abusive or unhealthy relationship. And we tend to think of relationships as caregiving systems that strengthen and support each member. We have to remember that as humans, we're social animals, and this important link to other humans and connection to other humans was actually a survival essential for us. And so we developed through evolution characteristics such as being loving and trusting and mutually respectful and fair and reciprocal and altruistic and cooperative, all those fabulous things. And we label those as pro-social emotions and behaviors because they build a bond of sociality among humans. And I like to just kind of describe this as we need to know if someone can be dependable and predictable and trustworthy in a relationship. And in a survival instinct, this is sort of, do you have my back? And when I work with people in therapy, I often check with them, do you feel your partner has your back? Can you really depend on them? And this triggers in them a primal understanding of this need for safety and trust and predictability. So if we look at Donald Trump and consider whether he is in a relationship with us as a country, it's pretty quickly clear that he is certainly not healthy. This is not a healthy relationship, and we could very clearly call it abusive. He cares only about himself. He really cannot care about anybody else. He's been busy golfing in, January and February. He had, 8 campaign rallies in January and February. He's more worried about the economy and the election and ratings than anyone dying. And this is a complete lack of empathy. When 799 people died in New York a couple of days ago, he tweeted about the ratings for his White House press conference and mentioning the Bachelor final. I mean, this is just unbelievable lack of care in this person. Bandy, I saw in your Twitter feed, somebody responded tonight that Trump had mentioned how popular his Facebook account was on a day when 18,000 people, total had at that point died of the coronavirus. So we could go on and on. He's cruel, he's vindictive, he's hateful in his words and policies. He's just not warm and empathic. I'm from Michigan, and he's called the governor of my state a half-wit and that woman, and refuses to use her name. I mean, he's just unbelievably very immoral behaviors. There's no other way to describe it. And if we go back to that idea of, can we trust him? Does he have our back? And I think the answer is pretty clear, that we cannot trust that he will do the right thing. And this violates our primal need for safety and dependability in relationships. And it's just frightening to anybody who's ever been in an abusive relationship. We know that experience of being uncertain of how the other person's going to react. So clearly, again, if we go back to our definition of healthy relationships, we can see that he's weakening our country. I don't think anyone feels stronger as a person or as a country at this moment after 3 years of Donald Trump in office. So abusers create unhealthy relationships. They sow chaos and distrust, and they destroy the people in the relationships around them. And they destroy connection and human bonding and human attachment. Really important things when we think about healthy psychology and healthy emotional functioning. So let's take a look at what plays out with abusers in relationships to kind of carry this definition a little further. And this also helps explain why people keep engaging with Trump as if he is a normal human being. They keep downplaying his faults and hoping that he'll become presidential. And this will help you understand why that happens. So most people expect healthy relationships. Most of us who've had healthy childhoods and healthy emotional functioning go into relationships expecting those pro-social emotions and behaviors from our partners. We expect to be cared for and loved and respected and treated fairly and morally and all those great things. And most of us go into relationships hoping to be liked, so we engage in those pro-social behaviors. And we assume that our partner is going to do the same thing, and it's going to be reciprocal and mutual. And when we meet up with an anti-social type of person like Trump, we kind of cannot comprehend that someone is so blatantly violating social and moral norms. It just doesn't really match with what our model is, because this model of pro-social behavior is very deeply embedded in our evolutionary history. And so many people healthy people keep trying to fit their healthy paradigm of a relationship onto this antisocial person. They keep expecting that that person will respond with love, that with care, with kindness, and they're constantly confused and disappointed. Frank Bruni, a commentator in the New York Times, recently wrote, he has sorrow and rage at Trump's lack of soul, which I thought was a very evocative phrase, because it really speaks to this primal experience of us expecting our relationship partners to care about us and then being disappointed when that expectation is so blatantly violated. And it triggers fears and indignation and sadness. I've written that pathological narcissists can get away with blatant violations of norms of kindness and mutuality because onlookers may see this behavior as incomprehensible. And this explains why many abuse victims keep re-engaging with an abuse partner, among many reasons, but they keep hoping for a different result. They maybe see some nice behavior and they think, oh, this person is finally going to respond in a loving way, and they're disappointed again. And this explains why perhaps the news media keeps engaging with Trump. They keep hoping that he'll be presidential, that he won't lie constantly, that he won't gaslight. And that never seems to happen, of course. The other factor here, of course, is that Trump is an authority figure. And most people have a great deal of difficulty recognizing abuse in an average interpersonal relationship. They find it really difficult to believe that anyone in this revered position of president would actively work to harm other people, would actively be a sociopath. It would actively work to hurt our democratic institutions and harm our foreign adversaries or foreign allies. And it's just confusing because, again, it doesn't make sense that someone would be so corrupt and so evil in their behaviors. And so people then continue to try and wrap their head around this, and they discount his sadistic and outrageous behaviors. I think a lot of people also imagine that if they were president, that they would never behave that way. So again, it's really hard to picture themselves doing it. So how could he be doing it?
Right.
So that's where I take that from. The other problem we see in this sort of abusive paradigm is that abuse involves a sort of helplessness. And when we think of trauma, trauma is a form of helplessness. We're not able to fight or flight against our perpetrator. And it's the same kind of thing in an abusive relationship. Most of us care what other people think, and so we engage with pro-social and immoral behaviors. But antisocial people don't really care what other people think. In a surface way, they don't really care. And so we're helpless to influence them to engage in normal moral behaviors. They don't respond to our attempts to elicit care and reciprocity. This is really important. I think this is why so many people are getting trauma triggered with Trump, because there's this extreme helplessness. Nothing we do does any good. We try and impeach him. It doesn't matter. We try to make him feel guilty. He doesn't feel guilty. We try to hold him accountable. Nothing seems to work. And that's really very, very difficult for most of us to comprehend. For these antisocial types of people, they don't respond to the emotion of shame or guilt. Criticism just rolls right off their backs. They have come to believe, through probably a lifetime of lying to themselves, that they have no faults. So they're really good at ignoring blame and shame. And when their conscience gets triggered, they don't see any problem. They're really not bothered by shame, and they don't see any problem in what they're doing. And so again, as a country, this is important because we've lost the power of shame to make Trump and the GOP behave in more pro-social ways. And that's really difficult, really difficult place for us to be. It's a very helpless place to be, a very powerless place to be.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Fisher will speak about peer support, how we can support one another in this environment.
Well, I'm going to get to peer support, but Harper, I thought that was fabulous, and found it very illuminating. And you sort of set up a point that I was thinking of the other day that I think complements yours. If we are all in an abusive relationship with the president, the cabinet leaders and leaders in Congress are the older brothers and sisters who are the codependent and enablers of that abuser. And that was really apparent in the story of the Navy secretary removing the captain from his command. The Navy in talking about it and the reporting on it, he was sort of trying to anticipate what Trump would want and handle it so as not to anger the abusive father,
right,
rather than saying, hey, I'm the Secretary of the Navy. I've got a Navy to run, damn it. And I'm going to do what's right for the sailors and the officers of the Navy. And you can just see that time and again. Even our national hero, Dr. Fauci, God bless him, it is clear that he is doing everything he can to save lives. Mm-hmm. But to do that, he's got to work around the whims and the craziness of the president. Mm-hmm. And you can see him sort of make that negotiation. So he's sort of dad might be drinking too much tonight, and the older brother is going to try to keep him away from the younger brother who's mm-hmm. getting upset and try to keep peace in the family. And so instead of having a cabinet and congressional leaders who are going on all burners doing what's right for the country, they're totally distracted trying to manage the president, who should be leading us instead of misleading us. I think what's also really important, there are two things that the pandemic and being in an abusive relationship seem to have in common. And one is that they both involve an ongoing level of fear and anxiety that we become accustomed to. So we end up feeling it's normal to be squirming in the household for fear that somebody might lose their temper. We end up feeling it's normal to have not know when I go to the grocery store, by picking up an apple, I may be signing my death warrant. And that background stress is, in some respects, it's more invidious because we don't recognize it. It sort of fades into the woodwork. And so the not being able to trust the leaders of the country to have our back, as you say, just exacerbates that. It's really fascinating in terms of studies of leadership, the success of Governor Cuomo, the governor of Ohio, others who are not trying to sugarcoat anything. They're talking about deaths, they're talking about threats, and people are rallying around them and saying, as you say, I can trust this. And that's so important. So with all of that, what to me is remarkable is how well we are doing. We are all, when they're not covering the deaths and the hospitalizations and the intubations, the news is full of stories of people in all sorts of ways helping each other. This new cultural phenomenon, it's sort of like a healthy wave of people clapping outside their buildings at night for the healthcare workers in our major cities. It's apparent, I keep hearing people talk about it, at how inspiring and how wonderful it is. I wish I lived in a more populated area that I could hear it. And I think there are some really important principles there that really do apply to how we all help each other. A couple that I find really important are that small things are really, really important. I got an email from a friend this evening who had taken her 6-year-old son around to his friends in the neighborhood and had given each of his friends a little bit of an Easter basket and an Easter card, and had arranged it all before so they knew they would be coming. And she told me about how much it made her son's day just to do that and see his friends. So doing that little act of kindness was really important for her son. I saw one in the paper or on TV a week or so ago where a woman whose elderly father is in a nursing home and can't be visited. She comes every day and just tapes to his window the outline of some lips. And now there are about 20 outlines of lips on his window. And he looks at her from the other side of the window. And that's all they can do, but it's very, very meaningful. We've been encouraging people to, I got an auto response on an email yesterday that a colleague said they wouldn't be looking at email for a while because they were caring for a family member. And, usually you'd see that on an email and you'd say, oh, well, I'll just leave them alone. I don't want to intrude. We're intrude. So I sent them a brief email just saying that I was concerned. I hoped everything was okay. And please don't feel any responsibility, any need to respond. And of course, I got a nice, equally brief note today thanking me. If you haven't heard from somebody for a while, call them. Don't be bashful. We're all appreciating each other reaching out to us. Even bad jokes, we're happy to get the intent behind the bad joke, even if it doesn't make us laugh very hard. So I think it is really remarkable and good to see that with all the horror that surrounds us and the exacerbation by this horrible person in the White House, nevertheless, you know, the younger brothers and sisters, if you go back to the family metaphor, are doing pretty good with each other. And we need to encourage that. We need to recognize that could be done, and we need not to be bashful about participating in it. So I think I'll stop there, Bandy.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Now we got a lot of questions from the public, and won't have great questions, but we won't have time to go through all of them. So I'm just going to pick a few since our time is limited. First one is, how has a man with such severe psychopathology been able to attract and retain the support of millions of Americans? Do you think that speaks more to his ability to con and deceive, part of his psychopathology, or to the troubled mindset of those who support him? Would either of you like to answer?
Go ahead, Harper.
Well, that's been much discussed, and I've written a blog about it on my website, harperwest.co, if you want to go read it. I think both. I mean, Trump certainly has an amazing ability to con and deceive, as the questioner says. He's been a salesman all his life, selling, you know, gold-plated nothings. And yet I do also agree that there is a troubled mindset in his followers. I tend to think that there's two types of people who follow Trump, and this is very simplified, so pardon me for being so simplistic in this format. One is a victim of abuse. I think there are some people who grow up in abusive households or have had abusive and traumatic histories, and they're very attracted to somebody who appears strong and powerful, and this feels normal to them, and even the abusive dynamic can feel normal to them, so they're attracted to that. I use two terms in my work around the emotion of shame. When people can't handle shame, when they don't tolerate shame, they can engage in two strategies. One is to offload blame and shame to other people. I call these other blamers. And then people who grow up in abusive situations around those other blamers often become self-blamers. They take on too much guilt and blame and shame. And this is a dynamic that they've often learned in childhood from an abusive parent. So to this abuse victim, this feels normal to have this big person in the White House, this authority figure, blaming and shaming everybody around them, because that's what they grew up with probably. And they're used to taking on all that guilt and blame and shame. So this dynamic feels normal. That's one type of person. I think other people are also sort of co-narcissists or also sociopathic in their behavior. And they are so attracted to what Trump has, which is an impunity from accountability. They love the fact that he can lie without accountability, cheat, be corrupt, treasonous, whatever he's doing, he can do it without accountability, because that's what they want. They also want freedom from shame, and they don't have that in their life, so they look to him and they go, wow, he can go on stage and lie over and over and not be held accountable. I wish I could have that in my life, and they're attracted to it. So that's, again, a very simplistic way of looking at it, those two types of people who are attracted to Trump. Be my thought on it.
Great.
And,
yes.
And I would just add, as a sort of context of that, the tremendous growth of income inequality in our country and around the world over the last 30 years, so that there is a tremendous amount of consciousness of real reason for disgruntlement and envy about the people who are ripping off the system and taking advantage. And then coupled with that, with the false consciousness of people who are led to believe that the enemy is the poor person who's getting a welfare check, rather than the person whose income has gone up 10 times while ours has been stable.
Right. Okay, here's another question. I have PTSD and have found that the Trump presidency has exacerbated it to the core. Any suggestions on ways to calm myself through ever-growing alarm and fear, please?
Go ahead, Harper.
Oh, well, again, a lot to say on that one. I think recognizing that it probably is a past memory being resurfaced, that he reminds you perhaps of abusers from the past. One of the things we often do in therapy with people is to have them cognitively reframe it, to challenge themselves in a way of saying, this situation is different than my past situation. Trump may be dangerous, but he's not an imminent danger to me right now. Maybe my past abuser was an imminent danger, but I'm not in imminent danger right now. So keep working with that I call it the thinking brain, to manage the emotional brain that gets triggered by that fear. And I think to recognize that many of us are triggered in that way, maybe finding a little solace that many of us are triggered in that primal way of, as I mentioned, this distrust, this violation of our pro-social expectations and relationships is deep. It's very, very deep. And so I think if you can try and normalize it and understand that many of us are struggling, that might help. I don't know, Ed, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I just push a little on that. I think the threat that Trump poses to people is very real. Mm-hmm. And, you and I both live in states with Democratic governors. Mm-hmm. And were we hospitalized and not to have access to all the things we need, there are articles today about the ratio of dollars per patient in Nebraska versus New York is like a factor of 10. And so the way Trump has willfully mishandled the pandemic and shown favoritism, I think puts us at very real risk. And I think people are conscious of that at some point. So I think, fear is never simple. Trauma is never simple. I think the other thing, though, I would also encourage, one is to recognize, yeah, you're right. It is the president who's making it worse for you. This is not crazy. This is understandable. The other thing is you have the opportunity to reach out to those other younger brothers and sisters and help each other. And that seems to help. And so I would encourage folks to try to, frequent problem of PTSD is that it's isolating. Mm-hmm. And if people can find ways to get out of the isolation, they're not going to get rid of Trump, and perhaps not even the threat he poses, but they can have some sense of solidarity with others.
Right. The last question. Mm-hmm. Is there anyone out there? Does anyone care? Why can't the lawmakers push Trump off his self-appointed pedestal?
Wow. That's a big question.
Let me throw this to you, Harper, and see if you think the metaphor works. One of the things that's so baffling about people who've been battered is that they tend to stay in the relationship. Mm-hmm. And if we're outside the relationship, we say, how could somebody put up with that? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that attachment theory teaches us is that it's still a relationship. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think, there are a lot of folks around Trump who are, they're in the relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think also they're taken in by this fallacy that somehow he's going to change, next Christmas is going to be different. Right. And next Christmas is never different.
Right, and that's so true of most abusive relationships. There's usually
Right.
good in there that people are sucked in and believe that they're going to change, and they often are they're con men like Trump, and they, you know, can fool people into believing that they're good people, that they will change, that, oh, this was a minor problem, I'll fix it, and it never stands. And so I think that's part of it. And of course, well, you have, you know, partisan politics where we've come to the place where party is more important than country, it appears to many people, and that is disheartening because they're making choices that are not, I think, in the best interest of the country. But there's probably a lot of reasons people don't stand up to Trump and deal with him, and it's complicated. But he also is a very physically intimidating person from what I see on TV. I've never met him personally, but he uses a lot of classic dominance moves that many people, again, respond to very primally. He's very intimidating physically. If you watch him at press conferences, if a reporter asks a question he doesn't like, he walks towards them and he points at them, and he gets physically dominating. You know, his aggressive handshaking style where he pulls people towards him, he interrupts, he name calls, he shames people. He uses a lot of dominating techniques that make people submissive to him, and I think he's learned those over his lifetime. And so, again, I don't know what he's like to deal with personally, but I can imagine that perhaps even very powerful members of Congress have a difficult time, you know, standing up to him for some of those reasons as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, the best example of that latter part is what he did to Hillary Clinton in one of those debates. Mm-hmm. And think about it, you know, Hillary Clinton had been Secretary of State, flown all over the world, met with all sorts of people, been First Lady, dealt with marital difficulties. She dealt with a lot.
Yeah.
And she didn't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, because I think it triggers a violation of our norms. We expect people to not be so dominating and not be so abusive. Yeah. And they are. We don't know we're destabilized. We don't know how to respond to it. And many people just revert to what is a very natural, more submissive approach because it's a safety approach. It's safer to not talk back to this big, powerful person. And
in our past as a species, I suppose, you know, if you crawl down a little bit farther in the ditch and wait for the lion to go by, you'll be okay.
Right. It's a part of the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately, we've come to that primal place. Now we're out of time. Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, Harper. Thank you, Ed, and for our audience. And we will be back.